Hello everyone, welcome back. I finally decided I would make another video. And no, it's not the PlayStation 2 video like everybody expected and maybe wanted. Today we're going to talk about something that, at the moment now, unfortunately, due to probably dreadful internet connection, you will see this far out of date from when the subject matter actually came to be relevant in the world. But we're going to be talking about the new Nintendo Switch OLED Edition that will be coming out in early October of 2021. This was announced probably, I'm going to say about 2 weeks after this was uploaded. I'm going to guess is how long it's going to take. And it sparked quite a bit of controversy for a multitude of reasons, most of which are not based on actual fact. And by the way, deepest apologies for the video quality. There is a window right behind the camera, and it is glaring off the screen. So that's what that bit in the middle is, where it looks like it's just super bright. So, apologies. But then again, I had nothing more interesting to show for the background other than sitting on the Switch for 20 minutes and, trying to change it up a little bit here. Give us something to actually watch in the background, So, you can let me know what you think of this new format idea. I don't know. It might work, it might not. We'll see. But anyway, back to the actual topic at hand. The Nintendo Switch OLED Edition is going to be a revised version of the Nintendo Switch, which came out in 2017. And it is a minor upgrade, we shall say. Think of it as like a PlayStation 4 Slim, an Xbox One S, a PlayStation 3 Slim, Xbox 360S, PlayStation 2 Slim. You get the idea. It's basically like, the slightly newer version of the system that comes out around about the halfway point to, like, they make some improvements, some cheaper components, some quality of life improvements. That's what this is. But with the Nintendo Switch, there was sort of an expectation around it. People, since, I'm going to say about a month before the original Switch was announced, or a month before the original specs of the Switch were announced, back in 2016, people have been clamoring for a Switch Pro, or an updated Switch with far more powerful hardware, because the Switch was technologically inferior to every system that was available at the time of its release, and that still remains true now that we are in the 9th generation of consoles with the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X. It's more true now than it was before. So people have been sitting, thinking, well, these big new systems are coming out. They are far more powerful than the Switch, so the Switch is going to need to be more powerful to stand a chance, right? I disagree, and if you look at the history of Nintendo specifically, you would probably disagree as well. Nintendo have never really been a company to desperately try to make the most powerful console in a generation. They've never been one to do it. It happened one time with the Super Nintendo, and that was only because the Sega Mega Drive / Genesis came out 2 years before the Super Nintendo, and for Nintendo it was a bit embarrassing on their end because they were the kings of the gaming industry back in the day. And Sega had come out with this machine that was far more powerful than the NES, which was the most powerful console at the time. So, for Nintendo, they were looking a bit stupid over here with their now outdated hardware. They had to do something to get back on top and reclaim their lead on the industry. So they released a Super Nintendo, which was more powerful than the Mega Drive / Genesis. It would have been stupid for them to release the system that was weaker than the Genesis, because the only thing that Genesis / Mega Drive really had going for it at the time was the fact that it was more powerful. When the Super Nintendo came out, obviously that was no longer the case, so Sega had to change up their marketing, etc., etc. But to remain competitive, Nintendo would have had to make a more powerful console than the Sega Mega Drive. So that was the only time in history they have deliberately tried to make a more powerful console than the competition. It's not something they've done ever since, really. It's not something they care about. Nintendo are a company who don't really directly compete with Sony and Microsoft in that way, They're more content to do their own thing. And sometimes it works out really well for them, sometimes it doesn't work out at all. Example being the Wii worked out really well, the Wii U did not. But people somehow now have the idea that Nintendo suddenly are competing directly with Sony and Microsoft. And for that reason, they should do exactly what they do. I'm here to tell you that that's really not the case. They really don't need to do that. So let's take it back. Let's take it back. Why do people think the Switch Pro needs to exist? Well, I think there's two reasons. One, because people believe that since Nintendo has a system that is anemic compared to the others, Sony and Microsoft, since Sony and Microsoft have much more powerful systems, obviously Nintendo's system has to be much more powerful in order to match them, right? I'm going to tell you that doesn't matter. And the reason it doesn't matter is look at the Switch before the PS5 and Xbox Series X came out. By the time the Switch had come out, the Xbox One X was just around the corner. The PS4 Pro was already out. Do you see where I'm going with this? The Switch is weaker than a base PS4, and Nintendo didn't care about power then. I like to think, and back then, we all kind of thought, right, okay, the Switch is pretty weak compared to the competition. It could be in a bit of trouble here. It kind of looks like the Wii U all over again. That was a really bad Switch. I don't know why I did that. I'm going to die. Oh, okay. But but you know, a lot of people were predicting that the Switch wouldn't do very well to begin with. And they were wrong. The Switch is currently on track to possibly dethrone the PlayStation 2 as history's best-selling video game console. That's how successful this system is. It's ridiculous how successful the Switch has been. In such a short amount of time as well. It's already over, I think it's over 70 million units, and it's only been around for nearly 5 years now. Considering the PlayStation 4 has sold over 100 million in nearly double the time, that's rather impressive. But remember, the Switch didn't directly compete with the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One. It never has. But people believe that somehow now circumstances have changed, when they really haven't. Everything that was going on with Nintendo is still going on with Nintendo. They're still in the same position they were. They still have a very successful system on their hands that people are still buying. To upgrade the system wouldn't benefit them that much, in all honesty. But people believe that they do need to, because Sony and Microsoft did it. And the second reason that I believe people think that we need a Switch Pro is because people somehow have it in their mind that, say, big games, big third-party AAA games like The Outer Worlds or The Witcher 3, these big games that nobody thought would ever come to the Switch, but then came to the Switch. For some reason, people think that we depend on these games. Like, the Switch depends on these games to succeed. When, at most, they are bonuses. The Switch does not require these games to succeed. These games are not the best-selling games on the system, by far. The best-selling games on the Switch are the first-party Nintendo games, and that is always going to be the case. But people believe that, for some reason, the Switch needs these big AAA games to succeed. And I don't really know why. I don't know why people have it in their mind that these games are somehow necessary all of a sudden. These games are nice bonuses, and they are a novel way to play these games. It's a good way to play. It's great playing these games portably. But they are not necessary in the slightest. The Switch would do just as well without them. And that's the honest truth. So, a big, massive, upgraded Switch Pro isn't necessary. Nintendo doesn't need it. Introducing it would make a very small percentage of people happy. Most people wouldn't care. That's just the truth of it. It would probably cost them more money than it would make. Especially because, you need to think about this. You need to think about this logically, right? People were wanting the Switch Pro to be this massively capable system on par with the PS4 Pro and the Xbox One X, if not the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X. That is completely unreasonable for a multitude of reasons. Let's consider. People wanted it to have 4K support. 60 frames per second is a standard on everything, if not 120 to match the PS4 Pro and Xbox One. This isn't everybody, by the way. This is just some things that I've heard. Some of them are more outlandish. Like there are some people claiming that they needed an 8K Switch. Are you for real? Like, I hope these people are joking because the logistics just don't line up. You need to think reasonably about this, in that to put that technology into a device as small as a Nintendo Switch would cost a lot of money. Not just for Nintendo, but for the consumer as well. It would be a very expensive platform to buy, and it would be a very expensive platform to develop. And people's arguments when people say it would be too expensive to be practical, people's arguments towards saying, oh, the Switch can't have a 4K screen. If somebody says the Switch can't have a 4K screen, everybody goes, well, smartphones have 4K screens. Yes, they do, but the smartphones that have 4K displays are the most expensive premium smartphones on the market. That are upwards of $1,000 US. Do you think Nintendo is going to make a $1,000 plus device? No, of course not. It's not practical. A 720p display is perfectly fine for the size of the screen. I think a 4K display on a 7-inch tablet is a bit excessive. 1080p would be nice. I won't deny. I wouldn't complain if we got a nicer screen. But I'm not sitting here going, oh my god, the Switch is so low resolution. It's only 720p. It doesn't need to be much higher. Games look great on the screen. So I don't see why suddenly it's like we need a 4K screen for games that already look really good on the screen to begin with. Yeah, like some of the bigger games may look a bit not great, but you have to have some give and take with that. You have to consider that the Switch is a portable device with limited battery life, and the battery life already isn't great, especially when playing, again, those bigger AAA games. If you had it running a 4K display on top of that, not only would it be ridiculously expensive, but you'd probably get about half an hour's worth of battery life if you ran it at full settings. Do you see how impractical? The more you look into the Switch Pro, the more you start to realise it doesn't make any sense. It's not practical to release a device that could compete with the PS5 in that form factor. You can't do it. The system would likely face several cooling issues because cooling chips that powerful requires a big system. Do you see the size of the PS5? Do you see the shape of the Xbox Series X? People are wanting to cram that into a device as thin and light and small as a Nintendo Switch. It doesn't make sense. That's just the truth of it. It doesn't make sense no matter what way you slice it. But people were surprisingly still incredibly disappointed at the announcement of the Switch OLED. And ever since the Switch was announced, people have been clamoring on about the Switch Pro existing, as I've said. But whenever I see somebody talk about Switch Pro, I would go, no, that won't ever exist. I am one of those people who never believed the Switch Pro would exist, because I looked at the company we're talking about here. It's Nintendo. They're not known for doing that kind of thing. They never have been, except with the one exception of the Super Nintendo. They're not known for making super powerful hardware that outclasses everybody else. They don't need to do that. They've never needed to do that, except for the Super Nintendo again. But somehow, apparently now, they need to compete with Sony and Microsoft? I don't think so. I think they're doing perfectly fine on their own. They've been doing perfectly fine on their own since the Wii. They did great with the Wii, and then they were able to survive the Wii U generation with the money they made from the Wii. But then, with the Switch, which was a runaway success again, they made more money. They're now a very successful. They are still a very highly profitable company, a very successful company, who does not need to directly compete with the PS5 and Xbox Series X, because like it or not, the demographics for a Nintendo Switch are not the same demographics for a PS5 and Xbox Series X. If you are a person who is interested in these big multi-platform games, such as, like, I don't know, games like Cyberpunk or Call of Duty, or, you know, games that are on both PS5 and Xbox Series X, the big multi-platform games, if you care about why did I send, I don't know, why did I send this in? But if you care about those kind of games, you definitely have a platform to play them on. You're not sitting with just a Nintendo Switch if you care about those kind of games. You would never sit with just a Nintendo console if you care about those kind of games, because those kind of games haven't been standard on Nintendo consoles since the GameCube. And if you want to be really if you want to be really honest with yourself here, multi-platform games have never been on Nintendo systems. Because back when Nintendo was the most popular console manufacturer, multi-platform games weren't really a thing. Like, yes, you got a game called Aladdin on the Super Nintendo, you got a game called Aladdin on the Sega Genesis, but they were completely different games. If you got a game with the same name on two different systems, it was likely a completely different build of the game in both instances. So, and then when you move on to the N64, when multi-platform games started to be a thing, Nintendo had butchered the N64 so badly with cartridges. Not hating on the N64, I think it's a great system, but using the cartridges was a big mistake that cost them dearly. And the proof of that is that when the big third-party games started to exist, all the third parties went to Sony, and in some cases Sega. So once again, third-party games weren't really that much of a thing. They existed. You did get games that came out on the PlayStation, you did get games that came out also on the Sega Saturn, but very rarely would those same games come to the Nintendo 64 because it was just too difficult to get those games on to a cartridge. Resident Evil 2 is a good example. It runs on the N64, but that's a huge air quotations. It runs. It's a miracle the game runs at all. It doesn't perform very well, but it does technically exist. And then with the GameCube, they used mini DVDs instead of full-size DVDs. So multi-platform games like the Grand Theft Auto series, which is the best-selling game of that generation, never made it to the GameCube because you would require more money to be spent printing more discs for the games. And once again, the market for those systems is not the same as the market for Grand Theft Auto games. The market for Grand Theft Auto games is not the same market as the market for Nintendo consoles. So Nintendo have never really had the big AAA multi-platform games. They did get them in some cases. They did get multi-platform games. I'm not sitting here saying that Nintendo has never had a multi-platform third-party game in their entire career. No, they definitely have had many. But they've never depended on them. They've never only had them, you know? They have survived largely on their own 2 feet for most of their existence. Going from the N64 onwards, I think it would be safe to say that. Like, the NES and Super Nintendo did have massive third-party games that were just as popular, if not more popular, than some of Nintendo's own offerings. But ever since the N64, they've largely stood on their own, with third-party games being a thing, but never the main focus, never the main driving factor towards the Nintendo system. So I'm confused now as to why people expect and somehow believe that Nintendo needs these third-party games in order to survive. It confuses me because they really don't. They never have. But, you know, I guess people kind of got carried away in what I'm going to call the third reason, shall we say. Actually, no, not the third reason. It ties back into the first reason, honestly. People believe that since Sony and Microsoft did it, Nintendo needed to do it, right? So I think people got caught up in the hype of the whole thing, saying, well, if Nintendo and Sony did it, then if Microsoft and Sony did it, then Nintendo will definitely do it, right? No. No, they won't. But people have, I think, got caught up in the fact that since Sony and Microsoft did it, that means that Nintendo are going to do it as well. Not really looking into the history of why that's not really logical to think. So, we live in a time where the Pro system is now a thing that kind of exists. That's a thing that people believe. But once again, if you look back across history, the PS4 and the Xbox One are the only home consoles to ever do it. There is no other example of a Pro system ever, anywhere through history. There are system revisions, like the slim models of systems. There are changes to systems, like the Panasonic Q GameCube, which is a Japanese-only GameCube that plays DVDs. And the PSX, a DVR model of the PlayStation 2, which barely functions. But they're not Pro editions. They are the same system with a few quality of life improvements. Or the same system licensed out to a different company to give it some added feature. Or made by the same company, but marketed in a different way. The PSX does not upgrade PlayStation 2 games in any way, therefore it is not a Pro system. The Panasonic Q does not upgrade GameCube games in any way, therefore it is not a Pro system. It is an alternative system. The PS4 and Xbox One were in a very unique situation because when they came out, they were anemic compared to PCs at the time, compared to where technology was at the time. The systems were anemic, especially that original Xbox One. That VCR Xbox One, heavily out of date by the time it was released in 2013. So what Sony and Microsoft decided to do was, they decided they would, instead of supporting these anemic systems as their only option for the entire rest of their run, they decided instead that they would create more powerful systems. Sony basically relied on the PS4 to get them out of bankruptcy. Sony were not doing well at the beginning of the PS4 generation. They were in a very deep financial hole. They were not succeeding. It was, if you said Sony was going bankrupt in 2013, if you would say that Sony would likely be bankrupt by the end of like 2015, nobody would really have questioned you. That was a very logical thing to believe at the time because Sony was just not doing well. The only thing that they had going for them was the PlayStation division. Everything else was floundering. The film studio they have, floundering. Their mobile phone industry, floundering. Nothing Sony was doing was really turning a profit because other companies had just become more popular. Like Samsung had become more popular for smartphones and TVs and stuff like that. Other companies have taken over Sony's reign over those industries, and now Sony was in a very difficult position because all they had was a PlayStation line of systems. So they had to make a system that would get them money. They had to make the PlayStation 4 successful. And it was. They had to make sure they didn't repeat the PS3 and make a system that would lose them money on every unit sold. The PS4 made Sony a little bit of money on every unit sold, and the PlayStation 4 happened to be the more attractive system at launch from, like, you know, a functionality standpoint compared to the Xbox One. So it was super successful, and it made a lot of money. And then once Sony had more money, and they had established the PlayStation 4 as a massive success, and they'd re-established themselves as titans of the gaming industry, they were free to do whatever they really wanted. They were free to come back and make a new system if they wanted to. And they decided to, instead of sitting on the original PS4, which people were complaining was weak and technologically inferior to PCs at the time, they decided they would beef up the PlayStation 4 and make the PlayStation 4 Pro. So that users who wanted a more powerful experience to get a closer to PC-like experience on a console, they had that option now. And Microsoft, seeing that their system was even weaker than the PS4, which would mean it would be eclipsed by the PS4 Pro, they decided that they would create their own version of the PS4 Pro called the Xbox One X, which is a far, far, far more powerful system than the original Xbox One. And they offered that for the same reasons. Like, here, if you guys want a better, more powerful, closer to PC experience, here you go. But with Microsoft, you see, they're Microsoft. They have the money to do that. They are in a completely different league from Sony and Nintendo. They had the money to create a big, powerful system. Because remember, this is a fact people don't often believe, but it is true. Nintendo makes money off of their games and their console sales. Sony makes money off of licensing their games out to third parties, i.e., you know, the developer's fee and stuff like that. And they make money off of their console sales. Microsoft sees no profit from the Xbox division. It turned a profit 1 week back in, I think it was 2002, or whenever Halo 2 launched. That week of Halo 2's launch, they turned a profit on the Xbox division. That was the only time. It has never turned a profit before that, and it never turned a profit since. Microsoft are in their own league when it comes to this industry. They can do whatever they want and face virtually no consequence. They can lose. The Xbox division is, I think, currently at minus something like $8 billion US, and they are not missing it in the slightest. Because they don't need it. They're Microsoft. They have over 300 billion sitting to do whatever they want with. They're in a completely different league, and they were perfectly happy to create a super powerful system and lose money on it because they were happy to do that to get the system into more people's homes so they could ultimately promote Xbox Game Pass, because that's really what their game plan is now. There's plenty of people talking about Game Pass in other places, so if you're curious as to what I'm talking about there are plenty of people who have discussed Xbox Game Pass and what it means to Microsoft now more than their actual Xbox console itself. But anyway, back on track here. Nintendo isn't where people go for the big third-party games. PlayStation and Xbox are where people go for the big third-party games. And when people go to the big third-party, people go to the PlayStation and Xbox for the big third-party games, they expect to get a great experience. They expect it to be a super polished, super impressive experience, right? That's what they're buying the system for. The casuals are just buying the systems for a few select games. Oh, I lost communication, okay. Nintendo, people buying a Nintendo console traditionally go to a Nintendo console to play Nintendo games. And Nintendo optimizes their games very well for the hardware they make it on. Look at the Game & Watch. A simple LCD-based game device. Very cheap to produce, very basic hardware. But they made it fun, entertaining, and interesting for consumers to play with. Nintendo like to take simple technology and make it as complex as they can, but not make it too complex for, you know, the average person to understand. Like, you know, with the Wii, motion controls, instead of using the big complicated controller, you just swing the remote. You swing the remote, you swing the tennis racket, you know? They like to make things more innovative, more fun. Their concern is not how many teraflops can we put into our GPU. Their concern is how can we make this more fun for our devout fans. And when people see a gimmick like the Wii or the Switch, they take interest, they take notice, and, you know, that's what they like to do. They don't compete in the super hardcore space anymore. They haven't done for a long time. And it's working well for them. Yes, the Wii U floundered, but that was more a marketing problem than anything else, if we're being entirely honest. So, if Nintendo haven't competed with Sony and Microsoft in over 20 years, if we're going from the beginning of the GameCube generation, it's been 20 years now since they really competed with the main competition. And if you want to be really technical, they didn't... I know the Nintendo 64 is popular, but if we're being honest here, the Nintendo 64 sold about 30 million units, the PlayStation sold over 100 million. There isn't really a competition here, but everybody likes to act like the Nintendo 64 is this super big, massive success. It wasn't. But anyway, Nintendo does not need these big third-party games. They do not need to do what Sony and Microsoft are doing because they're not appealing to that market. They never have with the Switch. The Switch is its own beast. The Switch is its own platform, completely independent of what Sony and Microsoft are doing. And for that reason, it would not make sense for a Switch Pro to exist, because the only benefit a Switch Pro would really give is making the super advanced third-party games, the big, massive games that are currently unavailable to be ported to the Switch. The only advantage would be that those would be on the Switch. But remember, those games sell fine on the Switch, but they're not the main drawing point. The big third-party games are popular more so to the hardcore gamer who owns a Switch, in addition to a primary console to play those big third-party games on. It's so that you can have the novelty of playing it portably. And I'm not saying that if the Switch Pro did exist and Cyberpunk came out for the Switch Pro, that nobody would buy it. I'm not saying that. People would definitely buy it. It would be popular. Let's not be stupid here. But the thing is, the Switch Pro doesn't appeal to the masses like the regular Switch does, like the Switch Lite does. The Switch Lite made sense because there's so many people who play the Switch and only play portably. It's just how it is. That's just the truth of it. There are a lot of people who do that. So, for people to suddenly assume that the Switch requires the third-party support of the big, massive AAA games is laughable in some ways, I believe. Because the Switch really doesn't need those games to succeed. If you took The Witcher 3 off the Switch, if you took The Outer Worlds off the Switch would see no less success. I guarantee it. The Switch would still be just as successful as it is without those games. The Switch Pro would appeal to the hardcore enthusiasts, but it would not appeal to many people outside of that market. And unfortunately, that's something people just simply don't seem to be understanding. People have seemed to get caught up in the hype, and I 100% don't blame all those people. It's people that are hyping it up online, saying, oh, the Switch Pro, it's definitely coming, guys. It exists. It's going to be so powerful. Insane specs. 4K support. It's just... that was never going to be realistic. That was never going to be a thing. The camera's trying to collapse. Please don't. Right, okay, let's... yeah, okay, hand. Right, let's hope that... no, it's okay. I'm going to just sit and hold it a bit better. Right, so... where was I? Right, the Switch Pro... not needing to do the whole existence thing. Right, so... the fact that people believe the Switch Pro needs to exist is laughable, like I said. Because it doesn't need those games to succeed. It never has. But people have been caught up by the hype and the rumours and the speculation that has surrounded the Switch since it was launched. Since before it launched, no less. And it's really unfortunate because now there are a bunch of people who are incredibly disappointed that Switch Pro doesn't exist and all we have is a Switch OLED instead. But the Switch OLED is exactly what I expected it to be. If a new Switch model is going to get introduced, this is what I expected. And I'm surprised more people weren't expecting it based on Nintendo's history. But that's the truth of it, unfortunately. So, now that we've gone on for half an hour about what the Switch OLED Edition isn't, how about we spend a brief period of time actually talking about what Switch OLED will be? I wanted that strategy to last a bit longer. It would have been really cool to show that off. Oh well. Right, so the Switch OLED Edition is a revised model of the Switch that changes a few things up, mainly on the system itself. The dock sees very minimal improvements, which isn't a bad thing if we're being entirely honest. I mean, yeah, Switch Pro, blah, 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 but from a logical standpoint, this is pretty much what the Switch needed, I would say. If Nintendo was going to remake the Switch, this is probably what I would assume they would have done. So let's talk about the big changes to the Switch itself then. So, the Switch console itself will be getting a better screen. It will have, instead of having a LCD 720p screen, it will have an OLED 720p screen. And an OLED screen is basically, it's a brighter, more color accurate, nicer looking screen in general. And instead of being 6.2 inches, it's going to be 7 inches, so the screen will be slightly bigger. I think it looks good. It's getting rid of the massive bezel around the side of the around the screen of the system, which you'll know if you have one, you'll have seen it. But I mean, it wasn't that bad, honestly. So, but I mean, other changes include, instead of 32 gigabytes of storage on board, now we're going to have 64 gigabytes, which is a much needed improvement. I am very thankful that we are getting that because, I mean, even a little bit of extra storage is good for a system that has so little storage. And I mean, 64 gigabytes isn't a lot either, but it's a hell of a lot better than 32. So, and again, there is still the micro SD card slot, so of course you could still go that route if you wanted to. But having the extra storage there immediately out of the box is going to be great for a lot of people who just want to pick up and play. So, what else does the system have? Well, it has a new and improved, much needed, new and improved kickstand. The kickstand on the original Switch is a bit of a joke. It's a tiny little flimsy piece of plastic that you can snap off very easily. I think it's designed to be that way, honestly. It's super garbage. It barely functions. It's not something you can really use. The Switch OLED has fixed this issue by having a kickstand that is the entire length of the system, a big, massive kickstand that is much more adjustable. It's much better for actual use of the system, and I got right there. That was kind of funny. So, it means that you'll actually be able to play in tabletop and not have to worry about the system just falling over and being dreadful. So, what else is different? Well, that's about it really for the system itself. The dock, however, is getting a slight change. It's getting a wired Ethernet port on the back of it. That's the only real change to the dock. But people are mad because they wanted the dock to output 4K. I don't really care, honestly. I mean, if you blow up a game that's native 720p up to 4K, it will look maybe better. But honestly, you're still dealing with a 720p image that's being blown up to a new resolution. It's still a 720p image being upscaled. That's still what you're dealing with. But, you know, people are going to complain that the dock isn't better, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, so I think the dock also has extra padding in it to prevent scratching of the system, which was a complaint back at the launch of the Switch. As for the Joy-Cons, the controls for the Switch, they have not changed at all, which people are upset about. And to be fair, I can actually kind of agree with them on that, because the Joy-Con drift is a big problem. I still yet to suffer from it, but I haven't used the regular Joy-Cons in a while. I bring them out sometimes to test to make sure they don't have drift. They never do. So, but I use the Split Pad Pro for portable gaming because it's much more comfortable. The buttons are much bigger. It's actually a much better experience in my opinion. But anyway, that's about all the system changes. And you might be thinking, well, that's not a very big change. And you're right. It's not. It's the Nintendo Switch Slim. That's basically what it is. It's the equivalent to a PlayStation 4 Slim, a PlayStation 3 Slim, PlayStation 2 Slim, Xbox 360S, Xbox One S, Wii Mini. Well, I mean, it's not like a Wii Mini. A Wii Mini is much more stripped down. What other examples? Like the DS Lite, if you remember that from back in the day. The Super Nintendo Junior, the Atari 2600 Junior. Stuff like that. You know, the Slim model. It's a thing that's existed since game consoles really existed. Like, one of the first major successful video game consoles, the Atari 2600, is a Slim model. It's just a thing that's existed since forever, but now people are acting as though the idea of a Slim model is ridiculous, and the idea of a Pro model has always been about. It's not. I don't think we will see a Pro system again for a long time, if ever. The PS4 and Xbox One were a unique scenario. It's not the norm. And people should stop acting as though it is the norm, because it's gotten kind of annoying for people who know their history and know that it's not going to happen. And it must be very annoying for people now, seeing the Switch OLED existing, believing the rumors, believing the hype, the speculation that a Switch Pro is going to exist, and seeing that this is all they got. Yeah, I could understand why they're upset and annoyed, because they've been expecting this big, massive, powerful system, and they've gotten a very small upgrade. It makes sense why they'd be upset, but if you look into it, the minute you start to look back at Nintendo's history, you understand there is no way they would ever consider making a Switch Pro. It just doesn't make sense for the company. It doesn't make sense for the market they try to appeal to. It just doesn't. So, with that, I am going to leave this here. Thank you for watching. If you actually saw this and it didn't get buried by the YouTube algorithm, I thank you for staying subscribed. I promise it won't be as long a wait for the next video. And in the time it's taken to film this, it went from relatively light to pretty dark outside. So, Yeah, I didn't plan on this being a 40-minute video, but there you go. Nice surprise. Maybe that'll hold everybody over for the time being until I can get the PlayStation 2 video finished. That'll be fun, won't it? Okay, so I'm going to leave this here. Thank you for watching. See you later.